Scott, good to see you.
Great to see you, Andy.
Good to be here in Kona, always.
Great to be here.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a few questions as the Chief Nutrition Officer for Fueling about training your gut, training your body to absorb more fluid, more electrolytes, more carbs. We hear a lot about athletes needing to increase their intake or benefiting from increasing their intake, but not so much about the practicalities of doing it. So my first question is your body trainable in that regard?
Definitely.
Yeah, and do you think it's trainable by a little bit, a lot, or do you think that's an individual concept?
I'd say individual, but in the caveat to that, I'd say that yes, there is significant room to improvement, especially if you're on the low end of like, I'm really struggling.
Yeah, so if you're taking in a lot lower than the recommended dosages, there's something you can do about it.
And I think that's probably based on history. The athlete maybe historically has never really consumed much in racing or training, and therefore they have a lower capacity to do that.
Yeah. So what do you do? How do you recommend an athlete trains their gut to absorb more fuel when they're training and racing?
Yep. So firstly, I think establish a baseline. 3 tests. What is your average intake over those tests on the bike, on the run? Obviously documenting that. You can document it very simply in Fuel In or on a piece of paper. Work out what your average is. Okay, that's your average. Start with that. Then what you want to do is incrementally increase that amount until you probably get to your threshold where you start to feel, okay, that's where I'm at. Then continue to practice that amount. Once you feel better, it gets easier, layer on top.
Yeah. So how do you, silly question maybe, but how do you know what your threshold is? Is that just how you feel?
Oh, I don't think it's a silly question. I think everyone experiences it. It's probably that feeling of fullness where it's like, oh, okay, it's probably coming up now. It's either coming up that way or you're feeling a little bit that way. That's probably your threshold from very, basic terms. Next time you do it, do you get that same sensation? Again, that subjective rating of yourself. How full was I? How heavy was I? Did I get GI discomfort? Documenting that, again, piece of paper or Fuel In. That's really valuable information along with the actual numbers, grams per hour.
Duration of time. How long, ideally, would you like to see an athlete work on increasing their intake before a race? Is it days, weeks, or months?
Looking at the studies, most of them consecutive days, 10 to 11 days, to show significant improvement in the ability to increase carbohydrate consumption. Most athletes, they're not going to do 10 or 11 days in a row. Think about average athlete, one long session, hard session per week. Do the math, that's 10 to 11 weeks.
Yeah, so you start a couple of months out, 3 months out, and you just incrementally
build it up. Just go through that process of fueling your sessions correctly. Again, race pace or above intensity, yes, you're going to benefit from carbohydrates because the intensity is there. Now you're practicing getting them in the practical manner, I guess.
Yeah, awesome. Our standard recommendation is for people to practice with the same stuff that they're going to try to use on race day. Do you see, is that essential? Is that advisable?
Oh, I think absolutely. That specific adaptation to implied demand and what you intend to race with, I would absolutely practice with.
Yeah.
Is there a preference in terms of solids versus liquids? No, I think that's the individual based on how much carbohydrates they need, how they can actually practically get it in by carrying it on the bike or carrying it on the run. And that's really an individual preference.
Yeah, I've heard some athletes doing like a ramped approach where they're increasing their carb intake, fluid intake and carb intake before race. Let's say, pick a number, they're going to want to do 90 grams an hour, but they'll go to 100 in training and then come back down a little bit on race day. What do you think to that approach?
Look, I haven't seen any science around it, but yes, I believe in that approach. If you think of training, what do? You go above threshold. So then when you're back at race pace, it seems pretty easy, doesn't it? So I think it makes absolute sense.
Yeah. So I know you've got a lot of data on what triathletes do in terms of carb intake and also fluid loss and fluid intake. There's a lot of chat around, carb intakes. Let's aim for 90, 100, 120 grams an hour, especially for some of the faster athletes. Less is often said about volumes of fluid to drink because I think that is hugely individual. What do you think about what sort of volume of fluids athletes should be aiming to consume?
Yeah, usually the general recommendation is you don't need to consume 100% of what you lose. So understanding what your average sweat rate is probably a good start. We would generally recommend somewhere around 70 to 80% of that fluid loss that you would aim to consume in terms of fluids to replace.
Yeah, and we've said already that the gut is very trainable from a carbohydrate absorption point of view. In your experience, how trainable is it in terms of tolerating more fluids?
Yeah, I think it's very trainable. Same sense, like you're creating distension. You have different receptors within the stomach, mechanoreceptors, and they are going to deal with the stretch. And yes, it's uncomfortable. We've all overeaten. We get that uncomfortable sensation. I'm not saying go and overeat all the time, but
Yeah.
you tend to get better with it, and that can work. Same thing with fluid consumption. I mean, again, you've only got to look at hot dog eating champions, and there's a very classic example of a population that is training their gut to cope with higher volumes of food and fluid.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely something that I learned over the years, is that you first of all start taking in more fluid and feeling like the mechanical discomfort of it is what bothers you, and then a combination of probably getting a little bit better at absorbing it, but also just getting used to that feeling that passes after you have absorbed it, and getting your head around it.
And there is good scientific evidence related to that in terms of training the brain. So signals from the gut to the brain, and you're training that distension, that discomfort. That's as much as a mechanical thing as it is a psychological aspect. And that's an important part of gut training, is that psychology of feeling uncomfortable, being comfortable with being uncomfortable and pushing past that, and then training that repetitively as well.
Awesome. Well, I mean, it's good that we've moved on past the days of what I used to do, which was like minimal fueling in training and then ramping it up on race day, because I thought that would give an enhanced effect. So yeah, thanks for your input, Scott. Really valuable.
Perfect, Andy. Thank you.